بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. There was a question that was asked as it pertains to the Muslim parents and how they recognize and or identify if their child is in the gang. And I think that this is a very important question, uh, especially in light of the statement of Allah where He says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا قوا أنفسكم وأهليكم نارا وقودها الناس والحجارة الآية. Allah says, O you who believe, save yourselves and your family from a fire whose its fuel is men and stones, to the end of the verse. And so, if you're a parent living in the US or living in Canada or in the West in general, then there are traps that the Muslim child can fall into from the filth that these countries have to offer. And especially as it relates to America, from those filth, or from those traps that one's child can fall into is street life and becoming a part of some type of gang. So this is I find this to be a very good question. How does a parent identify if their child is involved in gangs? And the reality is the signs are obvious if the parent knows what they're looking at. Because sometimes children could slip through the cracks because the parent may not know what they're looking at. And so if we have parents that are coming from other countries and their children are first generation Muslims within this country, they may not necessarily be able to recognize those signs. So this would be me responding to that question about how one identifies this reality or one recognizes this reality. And again, it's like I said, the signs are very obvious. Sometimes it's just as simple as entering your child's room and looking around the child's room. If you see any type of gang writing, graffiti type writing on the dresser or on notebook paper and things of that nature, then this is one of the most obvious signs. When I was a teenager, the whole side of my dresser, I had gang writing all over the side of my dresser, all over the side of my dresser. Then I had on my bed. Sometimes I would write stuff and scratch stuff in the bedposts and things of that nature. So this is one of the easy ways to be able to determine if your child is involved in the gang. Another way to determine is if your child has tattoos or a tattoo. It could just be as simple as one tattoo, no matter how large or small. If your child has a tattoo with random letters, 2 letters, 3 letters, or 4 letters, and they appear to be random to you, then you might want to question your child as it relates to what those. First off, your child shouldn't have a tattoo anyway. But then you want to question, why do you have a tattoo of random letters? Why? Because gangs usually, when they mark their territory, so to speak, they may initial their gang. So say for instance, like I mentioned before, I was from a gang called Eastside Hustler Crip. So we would initial that on the wall, ESHC, and other gangs knew that. Then you would have, for instance, a gang like Rolling 60s Crip. They would initial it RSC, or a gang like Family Swan Blood, FSB, and that's forth and so on. So if your child has a tattoo, which they shouldn't have, But if the child ends up getting a tattoo, plus the tattoo has random letters, then that may be an indication that your child is in the gang. Another indication is if your child becomes obsessed with wearing a particular sports team's memorabilia. And the reason why I say this is because this is how gangs identify themselves. For instance, there was a gang called Main Street Crip. They wore the Michigan State apparel. You had the New York Mets, the rolling 40s, neighborhood 40s, they would wear the New York hats. My gang, we would wear the Philadelphia Eagles. So if your child is obsessed with a particular sports team, regardless if it's a national team or a college team, and regardless of what it is, baseball, football, basketball, and they have no desire whatsoever for actually viewing the games of that team, and this may be an indication that your child is in a gang, and whatever sports team that he's wearing, that is the sports team that that particular gang wears in order to identify and distinguish themselves from other gangs. Another way that you can determine if your child is in a gang is if your child, especially if you're in a situation where there's Crips and Bloods, if your child becomes obsessed over with or becomes excessive in wearing a particular color, regardless if it's blue or red. And in some cases, that may not necessarily be enough because in some cases, some gangs have colors where they identify them that distinguishes themselves. I'll give you an example. There was a gang in LA called Most Valuable Pimp, or MVP for short, and they hung out on a street called Orange Drive. So because they hung out on Orange Drive, they wore a lot of orange to distinguish themselves from other gangs. Another gang in LA, Grape Street Watts Crip. So Grape Street Watts, grape, so they wore purple to identify themselves. They would have purple rags and wear a lot of purple clothing. Even the gang that I was from, East Side Hustler, we wore a lot of green because it was the colors of money, and we were supposed to be hustlers. So that was hustler colors. And every gang that was known to be under the Hustler Nation umbrella wore green. East Side Hustlers, Hard Time Hustlers, etc. So if there is if your child is excessive in wearing a particular color, especially if it's blue or red, then this can be an indication that your child is in the gang. Another indication, and some people may not realize the magnitude of this, but the way your child walks, because gang members have a very assertive walk. It's almost it's a walk that if it's like they're speaking to you with their walk. If their walk could talk, it would probably say to you, "I wish you would try me." It's a "I wish you would try me" type walk, and so that can also be an indication as well. Another indication is if your child is in frequent fights, regardless if there are fights that he's having with singular people or he comes home jumped and things of that nature. If your child is having frequent fights, and sometimes you can tell by bruising of the face. In my quote unquote gang career or experiences for the years that I was banging, there's two separate times where I came home with black eyes. With black eyes, because you don't win all your fights. You don't win all of them. But if you have a child that's frequently fighting, and he may come home one day with a black eye, and he has a scar or a scratch or a busted lip or this and that. He's frequently fighting, and it's not from the perspective of him being bullied, and your child has a demeanor of one that's clearly not being bullied. then you might want to look into why is it that you're getting into so many frequent fights. That could be another indication of being in a gang. Of course, real distinguishing characteristic is if your child gets into trouble with the law. If your child gets into trouble with the law, being arrested and thus forth and so on, and whatever he's charged with, then this can be a distinguishing characteristic that your child is in a gang. And in a lot of cases, if your child is arrested, the police officers they'll tell you that your child is in a gang activity. He's a part of this gang. This is why he was arrested due to gang activity. The police will know. Another thing that indicates it would be the friends that they're around. Their friends, because sometimes a child may not have a tattoo. He may not wear a particular color. He wants to keep it low key. But his friends can't, and his friends don't. And so this could be an indication too. The type of people that your child is around can be a clear indication if they're in the gang, especially if they're all people that live within the same neighborhood, around the corner, down the street, and thus forth and so on, and he's always with them, then this can be a clear indication that your child is in the gang. Another clear indication is if you're finding weapons. Why would a 15-year-old need to be carrying weapons? Why would a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old, and even younger than that? Because a lot of people join gangs at 12. Why would a 12-year-old have a knife or whatever the case may be? And of course, without a doubt, if you find a pistol in your home and with somewhere around within your child's property and/or belongings, this is a clear indication that he must be a part of the gang. Then this last indication, or this last thing, it doesn't necessarily indicate that he's in a gang, but it does indicate that he's into some type of street life. If you find drugs or drug paraphernalia, and I mean it from the intent to if you're finding drugs, it's clearly that he's intended to sell and or distribute this type of narcotic, whatever he may have. If you find that, if you're in your child's room and you're for whatever reason you're in his room, and you literally find a large amount of drugs and or drug paraphernalia, this may not necessarily mean he's in a gang, but he's definitely involved in street life, and you want to figure out what's going on. You want to figure out what's going on. So these are some things that could be used in order to ascertain and or identify if your child is actually a part of some type of gang or is involved in street life to some capacity, inshallah. And hopefully for the parents that hear these statements and notice that their child has a lot of those signs, do you want to step in immediately and try to really figure out what's going on? And of course, the most natural question after that would be, I've determined that my child is in the gang, what do I do? Sometimes it's just as simple as moving them out of the area. And when I say out of the area, I don't mean that if you're living in Los Angeles, for instance, and your child is in a gang on the east side, you just move your child to the west side or West LA. I don't mean that. Because if you're serious about the gang, you could consequently be moving them into an area where it may be his enemies, or he's just not out of LA. He can easily take a bus right back to his hood. I mean, get him out of the area. So if you like living in LA, for instance, if you guys have family in Oakland, where Oakland doesn't have a real gang culture, then you might want to move them from LA to Oakland, because it's going to be very difficult for a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old to get from Oakland to LA, or even out of the state, And so sometimes it's just as simple as that. Get them out of that environment. get them out of that environment. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala knows best. Now.